各位观众朋友们，大家好，欢迎收看美南 JJ 观点。今天很荣幸的也有我们 Jim Nogway 来跟我们一起讨论时事。How you doing, Jim?
I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine, Jimmy. It's great to see you again.
It's every week. It's been getting more and more. We were just talking about it. It's a lot of things are looking up.
Yeah.
A lot of opportunities coming back.
Yeah. Well, we hope so. We hope so.
我们在这个 this is still during the pandemic times, especially in Houston, Texas, where it's very high numbers. So we're all still being very careful. 我们在疫情当中还是要这个能够看到有新的机会，以这个机缘，所以我们还是很 appreciative， 我们还是很感恩的心情。那 Jim 今天他有很多这个很好的这个话题想要跟我们讨论。Jim, you have some very good discussion points that that you suggested. Could you tell our audience a little bit about it?
Sure. Actually, I have two. One that follows the second that follows the first. And here's what I mean by that. When I speak with all of my business colleagues, personal colleagues, family members about what's going on today, the first thing they say is there is so much news. Everything is coming at us, and everything is so controversial. How are we to know what's actually happening? How are we to know what the truth is? And how are we to decide what our positions are as we go forward? And I thought that would be an interesting discussion to have here, especially between the cultures, between historical Chinese culture and American culture, and the differences by which news is reported, understood, digested, and by which economic and political decisions are made. I thought those would be interesting. And I thought maybe we could take a couple of examples of what's really going on currently, because things are not easy. Almost everything that we do is very complicated. And one of the things that I always think about is you don't know what you don't know. And in other words, there are things going on that we don't see, that we don't understand, that may be the most important of all. It's like they always used to say when the Titanic went down, they saw the tip of the iceberg. And icebergs are reported, I have no idea, I've never gone below the surface, but they say that there's 13 times underneath the surface of an iceberg, underneath the surface of the water, than there is what you see. And I sometimes think that's the case with what dominates our world today.
That's a good analogy. Very good. 就 Jim 他跟他的家人、跟朋友、跟这个商业的伙伴在聊天，他也知道。他们给他反映出来的意见就是，现在在美国有太多的不同的新闻，这个新闻的题目都是很惊人的题目，才能吸引你的眼球。你要怎么样来分辨这个新闻或这个事件的这个真实性？然后当你要能够分辨出来，那当然每个人都有不同的观点。但是当你分析之后，让你要你自己的 position， 你的这个理论跟你的了解度在哪里？他用个比喻，就说当年这个铁塔尼号在沉船，这个游轮沉船之前，有这个游轮上的这个看到了这个冰雹，看到了13次。但是你看到冰雹的时候，不代表因为你之前没有见过冰雹，你不晓得这个到底会。这个在这个海底下，这个到有多深？意思就是说，我们看到这个新闻的时候，到底新闻的真实性跟这个内幕是什么？我们这个平民百姓是不会知道的，所以我们就来讨论一下怎么去看这个新闻。I love that point that you made. I was telling them it's how do you decipher in what position? Like the Titanic example. We don't know. We don't know what's under the surface. We don't.
And here's what's getting more and more difficult. When I was young, we used to watch the news on television, and we used to read the news in the newspapers. And there were legitimate, disciplined journalists, and they would decide what news was important for us, and they would decide what was the best way to present it. And everyone had the same understanding, right or wrong, they had the same understanding. What people figured out is when they looked across the world, in the United States, we view news and economics and universities and books as a free, open marketplace of ideas. And people can exchange ideas, talk, and out of some of the talk and discussion and perspectives come better understandings. But what people learned in the 1950s and the 1960s is that television, and to some extent written newspapers, were a great tool of totalitarian governments because people like to watch television, and it's one-way communication. The person who controls the television controls the understanding. Some call it propaganda, some call it other things that I can't repeat in polite company. But nevertheless, everything changed about 15 or 20 years ago with the internet. And internet is not only multiple combinations of communication, two-way, back and forth, but it's interconnected all over the place. And it's almost impossible today to squelch information. Information will find its way. And as it's finding its way, it becomes confusing because there is so much.
I love that you bring that up. This is a problem in China. There's definitely a problem in Taiwan. What happened is that news has been sensationalized.
Yes.
It's become paparazzi-like.
Yes.
They want to attract a click.
Yes.
I think the internet, social media and internet has leveled the playing field for a lot of people. It brought a lot of good for everyone. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to news, you are right, because there's no more journalistic integrity. Mm-hmm. There's no fact checkers. There's no editors to check what you're putting out there. So it becomes galvanized. So if you're conservative and you will always watch Fox News, and if you're progressive, you will always watch any other news, and it becomes a blame game. I really miss the fact that before there was only 4 channels? No, 3: ABC, CBS, NBC, right?
And PBS.
PBS. PBS.
Yeah.
So 4 channels, and the journalists had a standard that they did not abuse. In Taiwan, it was like that before also. Not anymore. So what happens is society gets divided. Let me tell our audience, this is a very huge concern. It's a deep-rooted issue.
Deep-rooted issue. Yeah.
讲的就是我们这个现在，他小时候在美国只有4大台 ，ABC、CBS、NBC 还有 PBS， 跟台湾其实也一样，就是说，你这个记者报新闻的，他有个公平的这个尺度。也是有中央统一，就是大家会同意要怎么发这个新闻，不是像现在完全是为了吸眼球。就你刚刚讲说，因为这个社群网络的发达，所以变成很多这个新闻是没有经过求证、证实，没有编辑，没有查实是不是真实的，就能够播出来。当然有利也有弊。那我们来看一下 Jim 他对于这个要怎么样去分辨真实的信不信。So how do you differentiate? See, well, let's go back to what you said about internet first. I don't know, are you in, say, different chat groups on WeChat or WhatsApp or Line or social media where people add you, say, Americans for conservative Americans or Americans for gun control or a group about U.S.-Sino relationships? In all those groups, the person that start these chat groups amongst the Asian community, they usually have a certain agenda. So you only see the news they post, like conspiracy theory, right? Or QAnon, or a lot of these right or left-wing conspiracy theories. And these news are not I mean, you have to see both sides. The way I watch news, I see both viewpoints. Do you have to do that to kind of?
Yeah, I do. I look at it a little bit differently, and here's what I mean by that. There was a man who actually created Fox News 25 years ago. His name was Roger Ailes. He passed away a couple of years ago. But Roger Ailes figured out two very important things. The first one is newspapers, television, in the United States at least, are businesses. And so they have measurements of making money for their ownership and their shareholders called ratings. And the greater the ratings, the more they can sell for advertising time. Newspaper has been that way forever. And so what that means is, and you made it a very good point right at the outset of this conversation, they want to sensationalize things. And so glaring headlines, and some people in the news and television say, if it bleeds, it leads. In other words, the hottest story is the one that is the most gory, the most sensational, because people like to look at that. The other thing he figured out is that most people, when they look at the news, they really don't want objectivity. What they want is to have their own pre-existing positions strengthened, nurtured, underscored. And so to your question or point, Jimmy, about chat rooms, what I find is most people listen to the same people again and again and again. And instead of expanding the reach of their information, they actually contract it. And I participate in a number of things just by watching people come at me. But what I try to do is, and you're in the finance business, so you understand the concept of a portfolio. I don't want to have just a single asset. I want to balance risk and ideas and things by having a multitude of influences. And so what I do is I look at Fox News, I look at MSNBC, I read the New York Times, I read The Economist, I read the Washington Post. And what I find interesting is they all accuse each other of fake news. And it's very interesting to have a single event or a single trend and look at it from very different perspectives. And sometimes you think you're looking at something completely different. And you ask yourself the question, why? How is it? And you also said something really that describes this, and that is journalistic integrity. More and more standards are eroding. And it's not just the people who report the news having their standards, fake news, and editing things. What you don't see may be just as important as what you do see. Withholding information is very, very important, both for bad and sometimes maybe for good.
I'm glad that you brought up Roger Ailes and Fox News as the first example of news for profit that started the floodgates. We know Roger Ailes is a convicted felon. We know that he was disgraced. We know the amount of abuse he heaped upon Fox. Yes, he built it with a very strong management style, but there are so many women that came out and said what he did. And there are so many stories and verified news accounts, even movies, about how he ran the business and how he mistreated people. So I'm glad that you brought up Roger Ailes, because that's a perfect example of what is wrong with the news industry now. 刚刚 Jim 提到的这个福斯 Fox News 的这个创办人之一，他不是创办人，他是当初接手之后，他是第一位提倡把新闻变成生意在做的。这位先生他这个去世了已经，但是他这个。
What we have to do sometimes, Jimmy, and I look at this, yes, Roger Ailes' personal issues and the way he actually treated people, that really didn't influence his characterization of the news, but it did open up personal integrity. kind of issues. Many other newsmen, Charlie Rose, Matt Lauer, Brian Williams, you just go down the roster of other people, have also had those. And what it tells me, this is really, really very important, is if someone wants to be in the public eye, either as a newsperson, pardon me, or as a political leader, a business leader, one of the most important things they have to do is maintain their personal integrity. Because the moment that you're compromised, for whatever reason it may be, you lose your credibility. And once credibility is gone, it may be difficult, if not impossible, to ever get it back.
I love what you just said, because you're referring to somebody in the White House right now. Thank you, Jim. That is very fair. That is very fair, and that's very
and other
realistic.
Yes. Yeah, and I don't think it's any secret, but I have told people, my friends and colleagues in Houston, that I would like to see regime change in Tehran. I think it's time for the mullahs to go away and to let democracy rule in Iran. I think the world would be a better place. Iran would be a better place. But I tell my friends in Houston, I think we should have regime change at City Hall in Houston and in New York. I think we should change mayors in some of our biggest cities, because then we would have better transparency, better finances, better delivery of public services, etc. So regime change and the need for better leadership and higher integrity, the need for that is world over, everywhere.
Jim 说的这个他觉得私德，个人的私德跟你这个你个人这个私人的家族的事情，跟你个人的这个做人处事的方式，会影响到你的这个信誉，尤其你如果是公众人物。所以我很佩服他，因为他至少提到的是我们现在在白宫的这位先生，很公平的这样子讲。那他刚刚也提到很重要的一点，就是关于在美国，他觉得他希望伊朗能够自由的选举，他希望德州、美国一些城市或者一些州能够 regime change， 就是这个政权要换掉。但是他忘掉一点是，在美国你是可以用你的选票改变这一切的，你有这个选择。但是在伊朗，在某些国家是没有这个选择的。So I was telling our audience that yes, what he said is true. However, in Iran, people don't really have the choice of voting someone out of office. Here, we do have the choice. If you're displeased with the leadership in City Hall or in the state office, you have your vote. Mm-hmm. Get out your vote. And we keep telling our Asian audience, Asian Americans, lowest voting turnout historically, that you got to get out and vote, because you could talk all you want and send articles all you want, but without voting, because voting is a privilege, not a right. There were a lot of wars waged to protect this freedom. Mm-hmm. And if you are truly American, you have to go out there and vote people out of office, vote in people that you believe in. That's the easiest and most simple way to participate. But yet I could hear, I'm sure you have too, a lot of people will say, well, my vote doesn't count. No one listens to me. It doesn't matter. And they just want to be angry for the sake of being angry, because it's easier to be angry and hateful than to change, right?
Well, yes, and that's part of the psychology, because if you're angry and you think that your vote doesn't count, then you can blame everyone else for what's wrong. But now we come full circle with the whole concept of news. And the reason that I wanted to bring this up for our discussion today, if you are a citizen of the United States, say, or China, you have a responsibility not just to let news come at you. You have a responsibility to make up your mind, to do things, and then to hold your leadership and other people accountable. That's particularly true in a democracy, but I would argue it's also true in other forms of government. Many people look at President Xi and say he has constituencies too. He can only hold office as long as people stay happy. If the broad populace becomes significantly unhappy, there may be some changes.
You believe that?
And that has happened. Look what happened to the Soviet Union 25, 30 years ago. Look what happened in Yugoslavia. Look what happened in East Germany.
Do you believe it could happen in China?
And it could. Power is not ultimate. It may last for some time, and there may be lots of protections, but everyone is accountable.
I really hope what you said becomes true, because everyone deserves a chance to have their voices heard. But what we're saying here is automatically already deemed anti-China just by saying, hey, perhaps the regime there will have constituents where they have to answer, and comparing to, like you said, East Germany or Russia. And automatically we will be labeled and say, oh, you're anti-China, you are, you'll be immediately wearing a hat. Does that make sense to you, what I'm saying here?
Well, it does make sense, but I think we should look at it now. It's easy for me to say because I'm a full ocean away, and we enjoy the freedoms and the protections of the United States Constitution and our legal system here in the United States. So it's easy for me to say. However, what I think the responsibility is still the same.
James.
Yes.
Jim. So, what if I told you that the majority of citizens in China, the ones that are, they could go across the wall to read news from all over the world. Even Chinese Americans that are here that can see news from all open sources, right? China is not closed in like before, where they actually do see news.
Right. Right.
What if I told you the majority of people believe they have rights? The majority of people disagree with what you say. They don't want regime change. They think that it's outside forces trying to divide China, that is interfering with a sovereign state, just like what's happening in Taiwan and Hong Kong, that the U.S. should not interfere. And if you ask people in Iraq or Vietnam or Afghanistan, they will say the same thing. How do you counter that?
Well, the first tip is, if a government, let's say in China's case, exercises censorship, to me, that is the first red flag. Information should flow freely. We should, if someone wanted to censor what information is coming to me, I would immediately suspect their motives.
Okay, so that right there, because it connects to our topic, right? Censorship. Mm-hmm. What if I told you that Chinese people believe, and Beijing believes, that they're not censoring, they're releasing information that are fair and not divisive. For example, they believe that it's like US 30 years ago when there's only 4 channels where everything came out of the Associated Press, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of US where there's news everywhere and it's so divided and it creates chaos and bloodshed, it creates hate. Instead, China says, hey, we're still sending out world news. We just don't want any news that could incite anyone or divide the government, or they could say that you are a traitor, right? Any news, any information where you're criticizing the government, you're a traitor. So how do you argue against that?
Oh, I think that you should respect every individual's right to make the judgment for themselves. The best thing you can do is give people information. If they choose to disregard it, that's their choice. But don't hold it from them. Let me give you an example. I think most people would acknowledge, even if they disagree or don't like Israel, they would acknowledge that Israel is one of the most successful countries on the face of the globe today. And it's successful not only because of what is going on, technological development, economics, all those kind of things, but how far it has come since its founding, really only 50, 60 years ago after World War II. one of my heroes in life is Menachem Begin, who was one of the prime ministers of Israel. Back before Israel became a country, the British called him a terrorist. Many Jewish people around the world called him a freedom fighter. Which is he? The reality of, he was probably both. He was fighting for the freedom to create a Jewish state, but by creating the Jewish state, he was taking things away from British rule and maybe Palestinian land. How do you make that judgment? And whose judgment is it to make?
Even now, you could say that the Arab countries, our friends, are going to say that he is a terrorist, even now. And there are going to be a lot of people saying that Israel is a terrorist state. So you see these deep-rooted, how do I say this, competition between the different countries, between thousands of years of bad blood, between races, that is very hard to decipher. As Americans, we could use our soft power to try to show people the way, but I don't believe that a hard intervention matters. But then come around and we look at World War II, we should have intervened earlier. You know, we locked ourselves up, we detached ourselves, and we allowed the Nazis and the Japanese to run amok. A lot of lives were lost. So either way, you could see which way is the right way to go, because every situation is different. Yeah. So, but I do see I always use Israel as an example.
Oh, you do? Good.
To my audiences in Chinese, that the Jewish people have been persecuted for a long time, and they're able to build a nation. But then you will have your Arab friends tell you all the things that they had to endure.
But just look what's happened in the last 2 weeks. The UAE, United Arab Republic, where Dubai and Abu Dhabi are, has recognized Israel, and we expect the other Gulf countries like Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar to follow suit very quickly.
UAE is one of the most progressive ones in the Gulf states.
Yes.
The situation there, people as Americans, we don't understand. Like each tribe, each kingdom is so complicated. There's so many minute details that we cannot just assume that we understand that we could change anything. I think that's the problem with this imperial. People could say it's imperialistic, right? This imperial mindset where we could colonize. That also reflects to what's going on here in the United States right now, the social unrest. Because what you told me earlier really strike a chord. The unrest in the cities, social unrest, social injustice. But see, how do you, for some people, we look at it as protests. Some other people look at it as riots. Some people look at it as criminals. Some people look at it as criminals in the police force. How do we come in the middle so we could have, but see, for BLM, for a lot of our minority Americans, there is no more meeting in the middle because they don't believe, nothing has been done, right? It's been going on for so long. Does that make sense? This is a lot to decipher because this is questions we don't have answers to.
Well, you probably owe your Chinese audience a little bit more of a translation here because we've been going on for a few minutes.
But thanks for reminding us. 我们讲到这个很多讲到以色列，讲到要用这个用美式的民主去影响别人，那我觉得这是一种侵略性的，因为别的国家，我刚刚也提到在中国，如果说你很多中国人不会觉得我们中国的这个言论自由怎么样会影响到生活，也不觉得这是个问题，所以提到说不能用这个美国这种民主的这种思维去硬套到别的国家，就像他刚讲，以色列是很成功，但是有没有想过别的这个阿拉伯的国家所遭受到的不满？他提到以色列之前的总理，英国叫他是恐怖分子，但是对犹太人来说，他是一个自由的卫士，捍卫自由的战士。但是他国家成功了，成立的时候，他现在是战士。如果没有成功呢，那就变成是恐怖分子了。所以就是说，每一件事情有不同的观点，但是我在讲说，每一个国家都有自己的文化、自己民族的个性。美国人不能用自己的思维再去硬去逼着别人去接受美式的民主。I was telling our audience that we should have learned our lesson as Americans that we cannot impose what we believe is fair and democracy onto other countries. It has to happen organically It has to happen like what happened with the Arab Spring, or with Gorbachev, with East Germany. These are things that would happen when enough of the population, like you said earlier, when enough the constituents realize. So basically, it takes a revolution. Revolutions usually have bloodshed. It's very rare there's a peaceful transition, and there's certain special interests that will take hold. I'm not disagreeing. I'm giving you not rebuttal. I'm giving you what other people would say, right? Because as Americans, we believe in what we have.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it works there.
Well, one of the things, though, in at least the 19th and 20th and so far this century, to my knowledge, anywhere in the world, there has never been a war between two democracies. They usually are wars fought between a democracy and a totalitarian government, or two totalitarian sides. There may be a civil war, that kind of thing. But over time, and it's not one consistent process. It goes and comes back, and many countries have changed several times. The borders of countries have changed as well. It's all a very, very complicated process. But to me, the test is more people by far want to come to the United States than want to leave. There are a few people that want to leave, and right now there's a very small amount because of expatriates overseas have difficult tax treatment, but that's so small. But most of the world would like to come here and have the problems that we have.
Of course, the United States has never been invaded. Our land has never been trampled. We've never been in a war where our people are threatened. And it took 200
land.
It took 200 years to build this, and it took civil war. It's a lot of civil rights movement, the unrest, the marches against Vietnam War. All of these led to what we have today. That's why the protests that's going on now, to me, there's an element of criminals. Yes, there's always going to be, just like there are criminals in the police force, but the majority of the police officers are good cops. Yeah. And the protest is the same way. Without protests, because our Constitution gives us that right, the only way to have change is to have that. Like I said again, Vietnam War protests help end the war. Civil rights movement protests help give us suffrage, affirmative action. All of that matters. Now, doesn't mean, how do I say this? Look, the way we view things in the U.S. is because of age, income, and education level, right? Mm-hmm. And also, I think race. I don't want to say if race is, because I am not African American or Caucasian. I wouldn't know what it's like. As a minority, I cannot tell you what it feels like to be Caucasian or African American. But as an Asian American, we're highly educated. I have 2 master's degrees. I have high income. So you would think that our views should be aligned, right? It's about law and order. But yet, because of maybe the age difference, but yet that's not true either. I have a lot of friends my age that believes the opposite, where this is riots, it's all criminals, and that this needs to be stopped, and that they deserve to be shot. And that if they just follow orders, this will not happen. See, you're open-minded, Jim. This is the difference. We talk about it. I could tell you're not someone that's tied up by their own beliefs, right? You take news in, you decipher it, you take a position on it, but it doesn't mean you're not open-minded to see the other side. But a lot of people that are young or old, or high income or low, do not think like that anymore. And that relates to the news, right? All these news that they're divisive and hateful.
What I find interesting, and I deal in the real estate world all the time, and so I'm a big believer that demographics drive everything. They drive everything economically. They drive everything in terms of the world, populations, all that kind of thing. But when people in the United States use the word diversity, we have the most diverse city, they implicitly mean ethnic diversity. And there's 4 big groups: Caucasian, Black, Asian, and Hispanic. But each one of those has lots and lots of
subgroups.
They don't all add up. But what diversity also means, diversity of age, diversity of income, diversity of class, diversity of education, diversity of opinions, diversity of political thought, all of those kind of things. And they all combine and intersect and frankly get in each other's way. But I think ultimately diversity is far stronger because it creates stability. You know, you create a portfolio of assets. You want certain things to offset and balance each other.
Hedge, we have to hedge, yes.
Yeah, hedge, okay? That's not always the best thing. Sometimes the best thing to do is to go straight forward and commit to one big thing. But if you're wrong, it's very painful, if not devastating. So
right,
my point is there's a lot of meaning of diversity that we often overlook. And I always am seeking out. I would much rather have a conversation with somebody that I disagree with. And that helps me in two ways. Number one, I'd rather listen rather than talk, so it's easier. And number two, I go away, I learn more. If I only talk to people that agree with me, I haven't learned very much. I'm not a better person.
Perfect. Now let's continue what we discussed today, because it's very interesting that this is a very big, comprehensive topic that has so many layers. So I really appreciate you. Thank you, audiences, for tuning in. We ran out of time. So 非常感谢各位收看我们美南 J 谈 J 的观点。那我们下礼拜再继续我们今天的话题。Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jimmy. Okay. Next week. I'll hold you accountable for next week.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you.